There comes a point in life when you just look around and think, what's going on? We work, we pay taxes, we sign forms, we take out loans, and yet somehow, no matter how hard people try, the system always seems to keep them in debt. But what if I told you that the entire thing, from the moment you're born, is built on a framework that quietly defines you, your labour, and even your identity? In legal terms you probably never agree to. And that's what we're diving into today. How credit, law, and language combine to shape the world that we live in. And how understanding that changes everything. Waking up the system. Most of us were never really taught how the financial or legal systems really work. We're told to get a job, pay your taxes, stay on the right side of the law, and everything will be fine. But behind all of that, there's a set of definitions, words that don't quite mean what we think they do. Take the obvious one, person. In everyday life, Jack Ordinary thinks person is a human being. But in legal terms, a person is a fictitious entity, a construct created on paper that represents you in their system. And here's the key, every time you interact with that system, signing a form, opening a bank account, or even registering something, you're acting as the legal person, not necessarily the living man or woman. So before we can even talk about money, we need to understand that the game starts with language. And once you realise that, everything else kind of makes sense. The birth certificate and legal identity. When you're born, something happens behind the scenes. Your parents, or in legal terms, your parents, state word, are required to register your birth. That registration is presented as a simple administration step, but in legal language, to register means to transfer ownership or title to another party. In other words, once your birth is registered, an official record is created, and from that point forward, there are two versions of you. Another legalese word. 1. The living man or woman. 2. The legal person. The name written in capitals on that birth certificate. Now here's where it gets interesting. Through mechanisms tied to the Bank of International Settlements and national treasuries, that certificate becomes a kind of financial instrument. It's used to create credits, numbers in a system that represent your potential future labour or energy over your lifetime. So the system now has a record of your existence and a financial projection based on your future work. And that's what allows governments and banks to issue currency and loans. It sounds strange, I know, but once you start reading all the legal definitions of registration, citizenship and personhood, you begin to see how they all work together. You, as the living being, don't actually own that legal identity. You act through it. But because it's the registered name, the legal fiction, the state claims authority over it. And that's the silent agreement that starts at birth. How money and credit are really created. Now, I touched on this in my previous video, but now let's have a look and talk about money and why we call it money. Most people think that money is created by governments or central banks. In truth, currency today is just numbers, created the moment somebody signs a contract. When you take out a loan, for example, the bank doesn't give you money that it already has. You sign a promissory note, a form of financial instrument, and that signature creates the funds. The bank then records that as an asset on its books, and you get to spend the money that you just created. But here's the twist. They treat it as their asset and your debt. So who really created the value? You did, through your signature, your energy, and your promise of future labour. That's why when you start to see yourself as the creditor, not the debtor, the system begins to look very different. You're not borrowing from them, they're borrowing from you. They need your consent, your signature, your person. Because without those, they can't access the credits tied to your trust. And that's what the entire global economy is built on. Trust, belief, and the signatures of living people acting through fictional entities. Debt, labour, and the energy exchange. So if credit is created from your signature, why does it always feel like we're the ones in debt? Because the system's designed that way. It turns your creative energy into a liability on paper, then charges you interest to use your own value. Think of it this way. They project the value of your future work, maybe 60 or 70 years of labour, and build a whole economy around it. That's why there's such emphasis on keeping everybody working, borrowing, paying taxes. Get it yet? It's not that labour is bad, unless we're talking about the current government, because work can give you life structure, meaning. But when your labour becomes a commodity controlled by contracts, statutes and regulations, something's being lost. You're no longer creating freely. You're servicing a debt that never really existed in the first place. And that's the loop. Work, borrow, spend, pay taxes, repeat. But once you step back and you realise that the credits originated from you, it shifts everything. You start to see that what's being exchanged isn't pounds or dollars. It's your time. It's your energy. That's why the idea of being a secured party creditor is powerful. It's not about having games with paperwork. It's about understanding that you are the source of all the credit. You're living behind the fiction, and therefore the beneficiary of the trust created in your name. Contracts, registration, and legal fiction. Let's go deeper into contracts, because that's where the system gets its power. A contract is only valid when both parties give their full consent and understand what it is that they're agreeing to. But think how often that actually happens. When you register a car, a house, even your children, you're transferring title, the legal ownership, to another entity. You become the keeper, the custodian, but not the true owner. That's why if your vehicle's registered, it can be seized, taxed, or restricted, because legally it isn't yours. And this idea extends to everything. Your property, your bank accounts, your right to work, all tied into that legal person. And here's where the legal language matters. Words like resident, citizen, driver, employee, minor, child, none of them mean what we think that they mean. They define a role within the system, a role with obligations attached. For example, a citizen, they owe allegiance to the state. A resident is somebody temporarily dwelling in a jurisdiction under its laws. A child is a ward of the state, not a son or a daughter in the natural sense. So when you identify as those terms, you step into the fiction and accept its rules, often without even realising it. That's how legalese works. It's a parallel language hiding in plain sight, where familiar words have very different meanings. And once you start to spot them, it's like learning to read between the lines. Taking back standing, living as the creditor. Now, comprehending all of this, it isn't about rebellion or refusal. It's about awareness. Because once you understand the distinction between public and private, the fiction and the living, you begin to make choices consciously. Standing as a secured party creditor means recognising that you are the living being, the source of value, and that your signature, your word and your consent are very powerful. It doesn't mean that you don't ever interact with the system. It means you know what you're agreeing to and you act intentionally. When you enter into a contract, you do so as the living man or woman, not as the person the system assumes you to be. When you use currency, you comprehend it's simply a token, a medium of exchange, not the source of value itself. And when you deal with institutions, banks, courts, or government agencies, you start to speak their language without becoming trapped in it. And that is real sovereignty. You don't need to fight the system. You just need to know who you are in relation to it. Once you claim that standing as the beneficiary, as settler, and the creditor, the system will start to shift in your favour, because you're no longer operating unconsciously within it. You're directing how it interacts with you, seeing through the illusion. At the heart of all of this is awareness. Everything we talked about, registration, contracts, legal fictions, debit, credit and trusts, They're all mechanisms. They're not good or bad in themselves. The danger comes when people don't realise what they're part of. Once you understand that the system runs on consent and energy, you can choose how much of either you want to give it. The irony is, the system depends on people believing that they're powerless, when in fact it only works because of their participation. When you see that you're not just a person, a citizen, a taxpayer, but a living being whose energy fuels the entire thing, that's when you start to wake up. You realise that equity, fairness, balance sits above all man-made law, and that's when natural law comes in. The idea that what is right honours life, not paperwork. So next time you see a form, contract, or a demand, just pause, ask yourself, who are they addressing, the person on the paper or the living man or woman behind it? Because once you start asking that question, the illusion begins to crumble. And when enough people understand that, the system itself will start to change. Not through force, but through awareness. Let me know what you think in the comments. Look after yourselves, and I'll speak to you all again soon. Bye for now.